The sterile smell of antiseptic had long since become Dr. Will's second skin. At 55, his hands were still as steady as a mountain stream, a trait that had earned him the reputation of being the finest cardiovascular surgeon in the city. But tonight, as he stripped off his surgical gloves after a grueling 12-hour shift, his fingers felt strangely heavy. It wasn't the fatigue of the body. It was the quiet, hollow ache of a house that had remained too quiet for 20 years. He drove home through the rain-slicked streets, the rhythmic swipe of the windshield wipers echoing the steady beat of a life well lived, yet incomplete. Will loved his wife, Mary, with a devotion that bordered on the sacred. When they had married 2 decades ago, Mary had laid her cards on the table with a bluntness that would have driven most men away. "I don't want children, Will," she had said, her eyes searching his for any flicker of judgment. "I want a life where it's just us. A life where our love is the only thing we have to nurture. Can you live with that?" At 35, fueled by the intoxicating rush of new love, Will had said yes. He believed then, with the arrogance of a man who spent his days fixing broken hearts. That time was a master healer and a persistent teacher. He believed that the sight of a neighbor's toddler or the visceral warmth of their own shared home would eventually soften her resolve. He believed that one day, she would look at him and see a father for the child they hadn't yet made. But 20 years had passed in a blink of high-end dinners, quiet vacations, and the comfortable routine of a childless home. Mary had remained firm. She was the perfect wife in every other sense, attentive, elegant, and his greatest supporter. Yet, every time he saw her pass a playground, she would look away with a coldness that chilled him to the bone. When he arrived home, the villa was bathed in the warm, amber glow of designer lamps. Mary was in the kitchen, humming a melody he didn't recognize as she poured 2 glasses of vintage Bordeaux. "You're late, Will," she said, leaning in to kiss his cheek. Her skin smelled of expensive lilies and something else, something metallic, like old coins. "Another life saved?" "Just doing my job, Mary," he replied, sinking into the velvet armchair. "We deserve a celebration," she said, handing him a glass. "To 20 years of us. No distractions. No regrets." Will took a sip, the wine dry and bitter on his tongue. "No regrets," he echoed, though the words felt like ash. Later that night, after Mary had fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep, Will found himself unable to close his eyes. The silence of the house felt deafening. He wandered into their shared walk-in closet to find a fresh sweater for the morning. As he reached for the top shelf, his hand brushed against a small, ornate mahogany jewelry box that Mary rarely touched. It was a family heirloom, she had once said, meant to stay locked. Curiosity, a surgeon's natural instinct, took over. The box wasn't locked. He lifted the lid, expecting to see pearls or perhaps a vintage brooch. Instead, his breath hitched. Tucked beneath a layer of silk was a single, yellowed baby shoe. It was knitted from soft wool, tiny enough to fit a newborn's foot. Beside it lay a photograph, cracked at the edges. It showed a young Mary, perhaps 19 or 20, holding a bundle in her arms. Her face wasn't the composed, elegant mask he knew. It was radiant, raw, and overflowing with a primal love he had never seen her direct toward him. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Who is this? He wondered. A niece? A nephew? But Mary was an only child. Her parents had passed away shortly after they married, leaving her with no living relatives. He turned the photo over. In faint, elegant script, it read, "Max. My heartbeat. My secret strength. 2002. The date sent a physical jolt through his body. 2002. That was the year they had met. The year she told him she never wanted to be a mother. The year she convinced him that a life without children was the only path to their happiness. He looked at the sleeping woman in the next room through the doorway. For 20 years, he had worshipped her honesty. He had sacrificed his deepest biological yearning because he believed her soul was too free to be tethered to a child. He carefully replaced the shoe and the photo, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the box. He didn't confront her. Not yet. A surgeon knows that you don't cut until you've mapped the entire tumor. The next morning, Will didn't go to the hospital. He sat in his study, staring at their joint savings account on his laptop. This was their legacy fund, money meant for their retirement, for travel, for the quiet twilight of their lives. It was a substantial sum, nearly 7 figures, built from 2 decades of his high-stakes surgeries. As he logged in, his eyes narrowed. The balance wasn't what it should have been. It wasn't even close. Over the last 6 months, hundreds of thousands of dollars had been moved. Not in small, untraceable increments, but in large, bold blocks. The destination was an account he didn't recognize, tied to a name that made the blood freeze in his veins. Maximus Sterling. Will felt a wave of nausea. He pulled up a search engine and typed in the name. Within seconds, a LinkedIn profile appeared. A young man, barely 21, with Mary's high cheekbones and a piercing, ambitious gaze. He was the founder of a new tech startup in the city, a venture that had recently made headlines for its mysterious, private backing. Mary hadn't just lied about wanting a child. She had a child. She had been a mother this entire time. Every sacrifice Will had made, every moment of loneliness he had swallowed to keep her happy, had been a lie. He had been the financier of a life he wasn't allowed to be a part of. He had been a provider for a ghost. He heard her footsteps on the stairs, light and carefree. "Will, I thought you had an early surgery today," she called out, entering the study with a bright smile. Will didn't look up from the screen. He kept his gaze fixed on the transaction history, the digital trail of his stolen life. "I canceled it, Mary," he said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "I realize there's a much more urgent operation I need to perform right here at home." He finally turned the laptop screen toward her. The smile on Mary's face didn't just fade. It disintegrated, leaving behind a pale, trembling mask of terror. "Who is Max, Mary?" he asked. "And why is he living the life I paid for, with the son I was never allowed to have?" The silence that followed was the loudest sound Will had ever heard. In that moment, the 20-year marriage didn't just end. It vanished, as if it had never existed at all. The air in the study turned frigid, a stark contrast to the humid morning outside. Mary stood frozen, her hand still clutching a porcelain teacup that began to rattle against its saucer. The sound, a rhythmic, frantic clicking, was the only thing filling the space between them. Will watched her with the detached precision of a surgeon observing a failing heart on the monitor. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't weeping. He was simply waiting for the anatomy of a lie to be dissected. "Will, it's not what you think," Mary finally whispered, her voice cracking like dry parchment. "Is it not?" Will leaned back, his fingers interlaced. "Because what I think is quite simple. I think I've spent 20 years loving a woman who was a stranger. I think I've spent 2 decades working 80-hour weeks so that another man's son could play at being a CEO, while I was told we couldn't afford the emotional cost of a child. Correct me, Mary. Please. Tell me this is just a very expensive accounting error." Mary collapsed into the armchair opposite him, the teacup forgotten on the edge of the mahogany desk. The elegant mask she had worn for 20 years didn't just slip, it shattered. "His name is Max," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "He was born 6 months before I met you. My mother, she raised him in the countryside. I was 19, Will. Scared, abandoned, and penniless. I thought if I told you, you'd leave. You were this rising star, this perfect man from a perfect family. I couldn't lose you." Will felt a cold laugh bubble up in his throat, but it stayed trapped. "So you chose to lose me while staying with me. You chose to let me believe you were my soulmate, all while you were funneling our life's blood into a secret world." He stood up, unable to remain in her presence any longer. "Don't follow me," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Will didn't go to the hospital. Instead, he drove to a nondescript office building downtown. He had contacted a private investigator, a man named Elias who specialized in discreet financial recoveries. Elias was a man who lived in the shadows of the city's elite, and within 3 hours of their meeting, the full scope of the betrayal began to unfurl like a poisonous flower. "It's deeper than just the startup, Doc," Elias said, sliding a thick folder across the desk. "Your wife didn't just send him money for the business. She's been paying for his private tutors since he was 5. She bought a house in her mother's name 3 towns over 10 years ago, with your money. Every summer yoga retreat she went on, she was there, with him." Will flipped through the photos. There was Mary, 10 years younger, laughing at a graduation ceremony. There was Mary at a beach, holding a teenager's hand. In every photo, she looked vibrant, whole, a version of his wife he had never been allowed to meet. The Mary he knew was the one who claimed to be tired, the one who said she needed quiet time. The one who convinced him that their duo was a complete universe. And the startup? Will asked, his voice hollow. Maximus Sterling's legacy is a disaster, Doc, Elias grunted. The kid has ambition, but no sense. He's burned through nearly 800,000 of your savings in 18 months. High-end office space, luxury cars for branding, and bad investments. Your wife has been frantically transferring funds to keep him from going under. She wasn't just supporting him, she was drowning with him. Will stared at a photo of Max. The boy had Mary's eyes, the same eyes that had looked at Will with feigned adoration every morning for 7,000 days. The irony was a physical weight. Will had saved thousands of lives, repaired thousands of hearts, yet he had been utterly blind to the rot in his own home. He spent the afternoon at a park, watching fathers play with their sons. He watched a toddler stumble into his father's arms, the man's face lighting up with a pride that Will would now likely never know. He was 55. The window for the life he had truly wanted was closing, or perhaps it had already slammed shut, locked from the inside by the woman he trusted most. When Will returned home that evening, the house was dark. Mary was waiting for him in the living room, illuminated only by the pale moonlight filtering through the French doors. She had changed into a simple dress, her hair disheveled, her eyes swollen. "I've sent him away, Will," she said, her voice trembling. "I told Max I can't give him any more. I told him I'm choosing you. We can get the money back. We can sell the other house. We can move. Please, 20 years must mean something." Will walked to the sideboard and poured himself a glass of water. His movements were slow, deliberate. "You're right, Mary. 20 years does mean something. It means 7,300 days of premeditated deception. It means every "I love you" was a transaction. It means you didn't choose me then, and you're only choosing me now because the well has run dry. I was protecting us," she cried, standing up and reaching for his arm. Will flinched away as if her touch were acidic. "No. You were protecting your son, and you were using me as the shield. You didn't just steal my money, Mary. You stole my time. You stole the children I could have had with a woman who actually loved me. You stole the legacy I wanted to build." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He had already drafted the email to his lawyer. "I'm filing for divorce. And I'm filing a civil suit for the recovery of the funds diverted under fraudulent pretenses. I want every cent back, Mary. Not because I need the money. I can earn more, but because I won't let another minute of my labor go toward a lie." "You can't do this," she whispered, the terror returning. "I have nothing without you. Max has nothing without that money." "Then I suppose you'll finally understand how I've felt for the last 20 years, Will said, his voice as cold as a surgical blade. "Empty. Except I have the truth now. And the truth is, I'm done being your benefactor." As he walked toward the door, Mary screamed, "You'll be alone. No one wants a 55-year-old man with a broken heart. You'll die in a hospital room with no one to hold your hand." Will paused at the threshold, his silhouette sharp against the hall light. He didn't turn around. "I'd rather die alone in the truth," he said quietly, "than live another second in your beautiful, expensive lie." He closed the door behind him, the click of the lock sounding like the final beat of a heart that had finally, mercifully, stopped hurting for the wrong person. He drove away, not knowing where he was going, only knowing that for the first time in his life, he wasn't driving home to a ghost. The weeks following the confrontation were a blur of cold steel and colder paperwork. Dr. Will moved into a high-end, minimalist apartment overlooking the river, a space that felt like a recovery room after a fatal surgery. For the first time in 20 years, he didn't have to check in with anyone. He didn't have to listen to stories about stressful days that were actually secret meetings with a hidden son. But the silence, while honest, was heavy. His lawyer, a sharp-tongued woman named Sarah who specialized in high-asset divorces, sat across from him in a glass-walled conference room. She laid out a spread of documents that looked like a battle map. "We have them, Will," Sarah said, her voice devoid of sentiment. The forensic accountants tracked every dollar. Mary wasn't even careful toward the end. She was desperate. "She forged your signature on 3 separate loan applications to keep Max's startup from being evicted. That's not just a divorce issue. That's a criminal one." Will stared out the window at the city. "I don't want her in prison, Sarah. I just want my life back." "The life you had is gone, Will. What we're doing now is salvaging the ruins," Sarah replied. "Mary is fighting the fraud claim. Her lawyers are arguing that as your wife, she had implied consent to manage the family's wealth. They're playing the mother in distress card, trying to paint you as the cold-hearted doctor who abandoned a woman and her child. Will felt a flicker of the old anger. Her child? He's a 21-year-old man who has been living off my sweat since he was in diapers. He's not a victim. He's the beneficiary of a 20-year heist. The legal battle became a tabloid-worthy spectacle in their social circles. Mary, desperate to maintain her standing, began a campaign of subtle sabotage. She called his colleagues, weeping about his sudden personality change and mental breakdown. She tried to freeze his personal accounts, claiming he was hiding assets. Mary arrived looking frail, wearing a dress Will had bought her for their 15th anniversary, a calculated move to evoke nostalgia. Beside her sat Max. It was the first time Will had seen the boy in person. Max didn't look like a villain. He looked like a frightened, entitled boy who had finally realized his golden goose had stopped laying eggs. Will, please, Mary sobbed across the table. Max is just a boy. If you take the money back, his future is destroyed. The company will fold. He'll have nothing. Will looked at Max. Tell me, Max. Did you know? Did you know where the money for your tuition, your cars, and your legacy came from? Did you know your mother told me you didn't exist for 20 years? Max shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to his mother. I knew you were the one paying. My mom said you were a silent partner. She said you preferred it that way because you were a private man. Will felt a pang of genuine pity, not for the boy's financial loss, but for the depth of the delusion Mary had constructed. I wasn't a silent partner, Max. I was a victim of identity theft. Your mother didn't protect you. She built your entire life on a foundation of sand. And now, the tide is coming in. Will turned to Mary, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly clinical tone. I'm not just suing for the money, Mary. I've decided to move forward with the fraud charges. Unless. The room went silent. Mary leaned forward, a spark of hope in her eyes. Unless what? Unless you sign everything over. The house, the secondary properties, the remaining investments. I want a clean break. You take Max, you take your secrets, and you leave this city. If you agree to a fast, quiet divorce where you admit to the financial misappropriation, I won't send the files to the district attorney. Mary's face went ash-gray. But where will we go? How will we live? That, Will said as he stood up, is the first problem you'll have to solve without my scalpels or my checkbook. You wanted a life where it was just us. Well, now you have a life where it's just you and the son you prioritized over my soul. Enjoy the honesty of it. The mediation ended in a landslide. Faced with the threat of a prison sentence, Mary signed. She walked away with a small fraction of what she had hoped to keep, her reputation in tatters. Max's startup collapsed within the month, the legacy becoming a laughingstock in the tech community. But the victory felt hollow to Will. He walked through the empty halls of their former villa one last time before the keys were handed over to the new buyers. Every room held a ghost. Here was the kitchen where they had laughed over burnt toast. There was the balcony where he had held her and promised to love her until his last breath. It was all tainted now. The memories were like medical waste, dangerous to touch, meant to be incinerated. He realized he couldn't stay in this city. Every street corner held a reminder of the man he used to be. The fool who thought he was a hero because he saved lives, while failing to notice his own life was being bled dry. We need a chief of surgery, Will, the man had told him over the phone. Someone with your hands and your experience. A fresh start. New air. What do you say? Will looked at the single suitcase by the door. He had sold the cars, the furniture, and the art. He had liquidated the reclaimed assets into a trust that he promised himself he would one day use for something meaningful. Perhaps a scholarship for students who, unlike Max, actually wanted to work for their success. I'm coming, Will said into the phone. As he drove across the city limits, he looked in the rearview mirror. He didn't see Mary or the life they had shared. He saw a man who was 55 years old, technically successful, but emotionally starting from zero. He felt a strange, terrifying lightness. He didn't know that in a few months, in a busy hospital corridor, he would bump into a nurse named Spacey who would spill her coffee on his white coat and apologize with a laugh so genuine it would make his heart, the one he thought was permanent scar tissue, beat with a rhythm he hadn't felt in 20 years. But for now, the road was open, the sun was setting over the horizon, and Dr. Will was finally, for the first time in his life, operating on himself. He was cutting away the past, and although the wound was deep, he knew he would survive. He had to. He had a lifetime of fatherhood he still needed to find a way to claim. The transition to St. Jude's Memorial Hospital was not merely a change of scenery, it was a sensory overhaul. The air here was salt-thick and humid, a far cry from the biting, dry winters of Will's past. As the new chief of surgery, he threw himself into the chaos of the trauma ward with a fervor that bordered on obsession. Work was the only thing that didn't lie. A sutured artery held firm, or it didn't. A heartbeat returned, or it faded. There was no room for hidden suns or 20-year deceptions in the operating theater. He met Spacey on a Tuesday, a day that began with a multi-car pileup and ended with Will standing in the break room, staring blankly at a coffee machine he couldn't figure out. It requires a certain level of finesse, doctor, or a very heavy thumb, a voice said. Will turned to see a woman in pale blue scrubs. She wasn't the polished, brittle porcelain of Mary. She had messy auburn hair tied back in a practical knot, and her eyes, though tired from the same 12-hour shift, held a warmth that felt like a physical touch. "I'm Spacey," she said, reaching past him to expertly whack the side of the machine. It groaned and began to drip. "You must be the new miracle worker from up north. The nurses say you haven't sat down in 3 days." "I prefer to stay moving," Will said, surprised by his own smile. "Stagnation is where the complications start." Spoken like a man who spent too much time around anesthesia, she laughed. It was a bright, unfiltered sound. Sometimes, sitting down is the most radical thing you can do. Over the next few months, Spacey became the quiet anchor of his new life. She was a senior surgical nurse, as sharp as any resident and twice as intuitive. They worked in a rhythmic synchronicity that Will had never experienced with anyone. In the OR, she knew which instrument he needed before he could ask. Outside the OR, she seemed to know exactly when he was retreating into the dark corridors of his memories. She didn't pry. She didn't ask about his divorce or the legal settlement that had made headlines. Instead, she talked about her love for ocean kayaking and her failed attempts at growing heirloom tomatoes. She was grounded in a way that made Will realize how much of his life with Mary had been spent floating in a curated, artificial bubble. They were monitoring a post-op patient when Spacey mentioned she had to leave early the next day for her nephew's birthday party. "Family is a lot of work," she joked. "It's the only work that pays in something other than stress." Will went stiff. The word family still felt like a jagged piece of glass in his throat. "I wouldn't know," he said, his voice clipped. "I don't have one." Spacey paused, her hand on a heart monitor. She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the chief of surgery title and the expensive watch. "You have a heart that beats for everyone else's family. Well, that's a lonely way to live." For the first time, Will told someone the truth. Not the legal version, but the raw, bleeding version. He told her about the 20 years of stolen fatherhood, about the baby shoe in the box, and about the boy named Max who was built out of his stolen dreams. When he finished, he expected pity. He expected her to look at him as a victim. Instead, Spacey reached out and took his hand. Her palm was warm and calloused from years of work. "She stole your past, Will," Spacey said softly. "Don't let her steal your capacity to want a future. You're 56, not dead." That night, for the first time in a year, Will didn't dream of the mahogany jewelry box. He dreamed of the sound of the ocean. As their relationship deepened, Will felt a terrifying sensation, hope. He started taking Spacey to dinner, not to the sterile, high-end galleries Mary loved, but to hole-in-the-wall seafood shacks where they got butter on their sleeves and laughed until their ribs ached. He found himself buying a house near the coast, a house with extra bedrooms he didn't quite know what to do with yet, but couldn't bring himself to ignore. However, the past has a way of haunting the present when it senses you are moving on. Inside were desperate, handwritten letters from Mary. She had tracked him down. "Will, Max is in trouble. The investors are suing him for fraud. We've lost the apartment. I'm working at a diner, Will. Me. At my age. I know I hurt you, but I did it for love. Doesn't 20 years of devotion count for something? We were happy once. You were his father in spirit, even if you didn't know it. Please, just one loan. For old time's sake." Will looked at the letters. A year ago, they would have sent him into a spiral of guilt and rage. But as he sat in his sunlit office, the scent of Spacey's perfume still clinging to his sweater, he felt nothing but a profound, hollow exhaustion. He realized Mary wasn't apologizing for the lie. She was apologizing for the fact that the lie had stopped paying dividends. He didn't reply. He didn't send money. He took the letters to the hospital's industrial shredder and watched as the last remnants of Mary's manipulation turned into confetti. He walked out to the parking lot where Spacey was leaning against her car, waiting for him. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. "Ready?" she asked, handing him a helmet. She had convinced him to trade his luxury sedan for a vintage motorcycle, a move his lawyer would have called a midlife crisis, but will call a resurrection. "Ready," he said. As they sped toward the coast, the wind whipping past them, Will felt a sudden, sharp clarity. He had spent his life waiting for a woman to choose him, only to find out she had been choosing herself all along. Now he was choosing a life that was messy, loud, and honest. A few weeks later, after a particularly long evening spent watching the tide come in, Spacey sat him down on the deck of his new house. She looked nervous, a rare sight for a woman who had handled thousands of medical emergencies. "Will," she started, her voice trembling. "I went to see Dr. Ayres today for my routine checkup." Will's doctor brain went into overdrive. "Is everything okay? Your labs? Your blood pressure?" Spacey took his hands and placed them on her stomach. The warmth there was different this time. It was electric. "Everything is more than okay. But it turns out, we're going to need to turn one of those spare bedrooms into a nursery." Will stared at her, his world tilting on its axis. He had been told for 20 years that his legacy was surgery. He had been told that a family wasn't in the cards for him. I'm going to be a father," he whispered, his eyes filling with tears he hadn't shed even during the worst of the divorce. "You're going to be a wonderful father," Spacey replied. In that moment, the ghost of the knitted baby shoe in the mahogany box finally vanished. Will realized that Mary hadn't just lost his money or his protection. She had lost the chance to see the man he was becoming, a man who finally had a heartbeat of his own to protect. The preparations for the wedding were nothing like the grand, cold galas Will had endured in his previous life. There were no guest lists designed for networking, no expensive floral arrangements meant to intimidate, and no hidden agendas. It was a celebration of survival. Will stood before the mirror in his dressing room, adjusting his tie. At 57, his hair was more silver than salt and pepper, but the lines on his face no longer looked like scars of exhaustion. They looked like a map of a man who had finally found his way home. He looked down at his hands that had performed thousands of surgeries, and realized they were trembling for a reason that had nothing to do with age. "You look like a man who just realized he's the luckiest person in the building," a voice teased. Will turned to see his best man, a fellow surgeon named Marcus. Marcus had been with him through the darkest days of the divorce, witnessing the hollow shell Will had once become. Will admitted, his voice thick. "I spent 20 years thinking I was a partner in a marriage, only to find out I was a sponsor for a lie. To be here, with Spacey, and knowing that in 4 months I'll be holding my daughter, it feels like I've cheated death." "You didn't cheat it, Will. You outlived the lie," Marcus said, patting him on the shoulder. The wedding took place at a botanical garden overlooking the ocean. The air was filled with the scent of jasmine and salt spray. As the music began, Will stood at the altar, watching the guests arrive. These were people who truly knew him, colleagues who respected him, friends who had seen his pain, and the nursing staff who had become his second family. Then he saw her. Among the well-wishers and the curious onlookers standing near the back of the garden's public path, a woman stood apart. She was draped in a coat that had seen better days, her frame thin and hunched. It was Mary. Mary looked 70, though she was barely 55. The elegance that had once defined her was gone, replaced by the haggard exhaustion of someone who had spent every ounce of her soul on a losing bet. Beside her was no one. Max was nowhere to be seen. Rumor had it he had fled to another country to escape his creditors, leaving his mother to drown in the debt she had accumulated for him. Will felt a momentary jolt of the old adrenaline, a ghost of the anger that had once consumed him. But as his gaze moved from Mary's hollow eyes to the end of the aisle, the anger evaporated. Spacey appeared, walking toward him. She wore a simple, flowing silk gown that didn't try to hide the beautiful, unmistakable curve of her pregnancy. She radiated a light that was blinding. She was the truth, standing in the sun. Will didn't look back at the shadows again. He focused entirely on the woman walking toward him. The ceremony was brief but profound. When they exchanged vows, Will didn't speak of forever in the abstract way he once had. He spoke of honesty. He spoke of the courage it took to start over when the world told him it was too late. "I promise to be the man you deserve," Will whispered, his voice carrying through the quiet garden. "And the father our daughter will be proud of. I promise that in our house, there will be no locked boxes and no secrets." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the applause was deafening. Will leaned in and kissed Spacey, feeling the flutter of new life between them. It was the most successful operation of his life, the total reconstruction of a broken man. As the reception began and the sun started to dip below the horizon, Will found himself near the edge of the terrace, looking out at the ocean. He felt a presence behind him. He didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The scent of lilies, now faint and sour, gave her away. "You look happy, Will." Mary's voice was a ghost of what it used to be. Will turned slowly. Up close, the damage was even more apparent. She looked like a person who had spent her whole life building a house of cards and was now standing in the rain. "I am Mary. Truly," Will said, his voice devoid of malice. "She's pregnant," Mary whispered, her eyes welling with tears. "You always wanted that. I thought I could make you forget that you wanted it. I thought my love and my need would be enough." "It wasn't love, Mary. It was a hostage situation," Will replied calmly. "You didn't want me. You wanted a provider for the life you were too afraid to admit you had. You stole 20 years of my life to build a legacy for a son who isn't even here to stand by you." He's just lost," she defended, though her voice lacked conviction. "Max is exactly what you raised him to be," Will said. "A man who takes without asking and leaves when there's nothing left to take." Mary looked at the wedding party, at the laughter and the warmth she was no longer a part of. "Do you hate me?" "No, Mary. To hate you, I'd have to still feel something for you. Looking at you now, it's like looking at a patient I couldn't save. I feel a slight regret for the loss of life, but I have to move on to the next surgery." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. It contained a check, not a large one, but enough to keep her afloat for a few months. "This is the last thing I will ever give you. Use it to find a place to stay. Don't call me. Don't look for me. Today, the debt is settled." He didn't wait for her to thank him or to beg for more. He turned his back on her and walked toward the light of the reception, where Spacey was waiting with a glass of sparkling water and a smile that reached her eyes. As the music swelled and the stars began to poke through the twilight, Will took his wife's hand. He looked out at the guests, at the ocean, and at the horizon. The 20-year mirage was gone. In its place was something solid, something real, and something that was just beginning. It was having to watch, from the darkness, as the man she thought she had broken became whole without her. She had tried to steal his future, but in doing so, she had only guaranteed her own obsolescence. Will laughed at something Spacey said, a deep, genuine sound that echoed across the water. He was a doctor, a husband, and soon, a father. He was finally, undeniably, alive. 2 years had passed since the wedding, and life for Will had taken on a rhythm he once thought was reserved for other men. At 59, his days were no longer measured by the sterile hum of a hospital ventilator, but by the frantic, joyful pitter-patter of his daughter Lily's feet on the hardwood floors. He had learned that fatherhood at 60 was a different kind of medicine, one that didn't cure diseases, but healed the soul. Will sat in his home office, a sun-drenched room overlooking the coast, reviewing a medical journal. Spacey walked in, carrying a sleeping Lily. She looked at him with a tenderness that still made his breath hitch, but today, she held a folded newspaper from their old city. "A friend sent this," she whispered, placing it on his desk. "I thought you should know. Not because it matters to our life now, but because some circles finally close." The headline was stark: M Legacy founder arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. The article detailed how Max had not only failed in business, but had crossed the line into criminal embezzlement to maintain his lifestyle. But the part that made Will's blood run cold was the mention of the primary guarantor, Mary. She had signed away the last of her reclaimed assets, even the small trust Will had left her with, to back Max's final, desperate gamble. Will's private phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated, then answered. "Will, please." The voice was a ragged shadow of the woman who had once commanded his household. Mary wasn't calling to apologize. She was calling from a county hospital ward, her voice thin and broken. Max is gone. He took the last of the cash and crossed the border. The police, the debt collectors, they took everything. I'm sick, Will. They say it's my heart. Irony, isn't it? Will gripped the phone, the cold ghost of his past trying to claw its way back into his chest. A younger version of him would have been out the door in minutes, stethoscope in hand, ready to save her. But he looked through the doorway at Spacey, who was humming a lullaby to their daughter. He saw the life built on truth, and he realized that Mary's heart condition was a metaphor for her entire existence. I am sorry you are suffering, Mary, Will said, his voice as steady as a surgeon's blade. But I am no longer your doctor, and I was never truly your husband. I will call the hospital social worker and ensure you have a basic care plan. I will do that as a human being. But as the man you lied to for 20 years? That man died a long time ago. You were supposed to be the good one, she wailed, a flash of her old manipulative fire sparking through the exhaustion. You were supposed to forgive. Forgiveness isn't a blank check for further abuse, Mary, Will replied. You chose a legacy of secrets and a son who abandoned you the moment the money ran out. I chose a legacy of truth. This is the consequence of our choices. He hung up. He didn't feel a surge of triumph. He felt a profound, quiet relief. A few weeks later, a courier arrived at his office. It was a small, scorched-looking wooden box. Inside was the mahogany jewelry box he had found years ago, the one that held the baby's shoe. It was empty now, save for a note in Mary's trembling script. I burned the shoe. I realized it was never his. It was the leash I used to keep you. Now I have nothing left to hold. Will didn't keep the box. He walked it down to the beach behind his house. He built a small fire in a stone pit, watching the mahogany catch flame. As the expensive wood turned to ash, he felt the last tether to his old life dissolve into the salt air. Will was finishing a complex bypass surgery on a penniless immigrant father of 4. As he stepped out of the OR, Spacey was waiting for him, her eyes shining. He's going to make it, isn't he? She asked. He is, Will said, stripping off his cap. He has a lot to live for. So do you, she smiled, taking his hand and placing it on the prominent swell of her stomach. The ultrasound came back today. Lily is going to have a brother. Will stood in the sterile hallway, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and the hum of machines. But this time, the hospital didn't feel like a lonely fortress. It felt like a garden. At 60, he was starting over again, but the foundation was solid rock this time. He had lost 20 years to a mirage, but in return, the universe had given him a reality so bright it made the past look like a dream. He thought of Mary, alone in her ward, and Max, a fugitive in a foreign land. They were the architects of their own prison. And he was a man who had finally learned that the most important organ in the human body wasn't the heart, it was the conscience. As he walked out of the hospital with Spacey, the evening sun casting long, golden shadows, Will realize that his story wasn't about a man who was betrayed. It was about a man who refused to stay broken. The million-view ending wasn't the tragedy of the past, it was the audacity of his present. Let's go home, Will said. I have a nursery to paint. 5 years had passed since the day Will walked away from the shadows of his past, and today, the coastal sun felt warmer than ever. At 62, Dr. Will stood on the expansive wooden deck of his home, watching the horizon. In the yard below, the scene was a chaotic, beautiful symphony of the life he had once been told he could never have. 5-year-old Lily was chasing a golden retriever through the tall grass, her laughter ringing out like silver bells. Nearby, in a small sandbox, 3-year-old Arthur was methodically burying a plastic dinosaur, his brow furrowed with the same intense focus Will applied to complex valve replacements. Spacey stepped out onto the deck, leaning her head against Will's shoulder. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The silence between them was no longer a void filled with secrets. It was a reservoir of peace. You're thinking about it again, aren't you? She asked softly. Not about the pain, Will replied, covering her hand with his. Just the sheer impossibility of it all. If you had told me at 55 that I would be standing here, with a son and a daughter, I would have called you a liar. I thought my legacy was going to be a collection of surgical papers and a drained bank account. Your legacy is currently trying to eat a crayon. Spacey joked, pointing at Arthur. Will laughed, a deep, resonant sound that felt solid in his chest. But even in this paradise, The universe had one final, closing move to make. It wasn't from Mary. It was from a legal firm in a country halfway across the world. Max had finally been caught. The M-Legacy fraud had been a global web, and after years on the run, he had been apprehended in a squalid apartment in Southeast Asia. But the letter wasn't about the arrest. It was about the aftermath. Max had reached out to the firm to request a victim impact statement, or a plea for leniency from his mother's former husband. He claimed that his upbringing, the lies Mary had told him, the pressure to succeed with stolen money, had forced him into a life of crime. He wanted Will to testify that he had been a victim of Mary's psychological manipulation. Will sat in his study, the letter resting on the mahogany desk, not the old one from the villa, but a new one he had built himself. He thought about Max. He thought about the boy who had grown into a predator. Then, he thought about the woman who had enabled it all. He picked up his pen, but he didn't write a plea for leniency. He didn't write an angry tirade. To whom it may concern, he wrote, I have no statement to provide. I do not know the defendant. I was once an investor in a dream that turned out to be a hallucination, but I have since liquidated that debt. Whatever the defendant has become is the result of the truth he chose to live by. I have my own truth now, and it does not include him. As he sealed the envelope, he felt the final gear of his past life grind to a halt. There was no more anger. There was no more what if. The event was held in the city where his nightmare had begun. He had hesitated to return, but Spacey had insisted. Go as the man you are now, she had said. Let the city see what a real heart looks like. As they walked through the grand ballroom, Will was a figure of quiet, commanding dignity. He moved through the crowd of younger surgeons, offering advice, his presence radiating a grounded wisdom. Toward the end of the night, as he stepped out onto the balcony for some air, he saw a familiar figure standing near the service entrance downstairs. It was a woman in a gray janitorial uniform, her back bent, her hair a shock of thin, white wool. She was emptying a trash bin. It was Mary. She had survived her heart scare, but the life that followed had been a brutal descent. Without Will's protection, without Max's stolen luxury, she was just another invisible soul in a city that had forgotten her. She looked up, and, for a split second, her eyes met Will's. Will stood on the balcony, bathed in the glow of the chandelier behind him, his beautiful, vibrant wife by his side. Mary stood in the shadows of the alley, clutching a bag of refuse. Mary waited. She waited for him to sneer. She waited for him to point her out to his friends. She even hoped, in some dark, twisted corner of her mind, that he would come down and yell at her. Anything to prove she still mattered. Instead, Will did the one thing that was more devastating than any insult. He looked at her with the polite, distant gaze one might give a stranger on a crowded bus. There was no recognition. There was no pity. There was only the absolute, cold reality of a man who had truly moved on. He turned his head to listen to something Spacey was saying, laughed at her joke, and walked back into the warmth of the ballroom without a second glance. In that moment, Mary realized her greatest punishment. It wasn't the poverty. It wasn't the hard labor. It was the fact that she had become a ghost while still alive. She had tried to steal his light for 20 years, and in the end, she was left in the dark while he had become the sun. Back at the hotel, Will watched his children sleep in the adjoining room. He realized that the 20 years he thought he had lost weren't lost at all. They were the price he had to pay to appreciate the heaven he was currently living in. He climbed into bed beside Spacey, the sound of the city humming far below. Is it finally over? She whispered, sensing the shift in his spirit. It's over, Will said, closing his eyes. The surgery was a success. The patient survived. Which patient? She asked playfully. Will smiled in the dark. Me. The story of Dr. Will didn't end with a grand speech or a pile of gold. It ended with a quiet morning, a cold cup of coffee, and the sticky hand of a 3-year-old boy reaching up to hold his father's. It ended with the truth. And the truth was, life doesn't always give you what you want when you want it. But if you have the courage to cut away the rot, it gives you exactly what you need.